Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Atlantic Bushcraft Adventures. Tonight we are on episode 204, and we are going to be talking about crown land camping versus park camping. There's pros, there's cons, there's rules, there's different things to go about it, but it's definitely a good topic for discussion. We did have a comment on our Facebook page that somebody was just looking up some of this stuff today, and they're interested in this, so they'll be joining us here tonight, hopefully. And that's pretty much what they were after, is like, what are the rules, what are the regulations? And the first thing to say about that is it's going to vary depending on location, and I strongly encourage you to check your local regulations and laws and stuff. Generally, whatever your natural resources department is or renewable resources in your area will have information on that stuff. Generally, parks and stuff like that, parks and crown land, are usually handled by that department, or at least in most of Atlantic Canada, they are for sure. Working for them in the past, I can vouch for that. But yeah, definitely anything we're going to say tonight is going to be kind of more geared towards Canada, as a full disclosure, because that is where we have the majority of the information. Though I do know some of it does translate to the U.S. because I've been down there, done a little bit of camping here and there, and it's very similar.
Yeah, I actually spoke with a couple of friends from the States a little while ago about this subject. And they have, I think it's BLM land. They also have Department of Natural Resources land, and there's different, and it's the same thing. There's wildlife areas, and all these things mean a lot of different things. And it's really important for you to look up in your area what the rules are. But overall, there are some things that you can kind of keep in mind that'll generally help you a little bit. And that is in parkland, which I think would be a great name for a camp, parkland. I know in park, like especially national parks, provincial parks, you are fairly restricted in exactly where you can go. Your times are set going in and going out. That's pretty well universal across it. There's a check-in time, there's a check-out time, there's a place to park your car, and a lot of people feel a little bit more safe, more secure in a park because they feel like there's that backup. There's government representatives there or owners of the camp that will come bail you out if you get lost or something. Although I can guarantee you that's not always true. If you call them up, they may very well tell you it's your responsibility to find your own way out. Don't ask how I know that.
So Chris Jones just had a little insight on this. Yes, BLM or Bureau of Land Management, mostly in the western and some in southern sections, not nearly as much in the northeast. So
yeah. So I mean, it's important to keep in mind. Even here, like I'm in BC, they have a similar system. I can't remember exactly what they call it, but basically, a lot of the off camping areas that aren't monitored by a governing body, they still have rules, and you need to kind of look those rules up. It takes a little bit to figure those out, but the neat thing is once you start Googling it, you can find that stuff out. Generally, as a basic rule across the board, in any of these places, do not go make your own new campsite.
No.
That's generally how you're going to get yourselves into trouble or get areas restricted more so. When you go camping, look for existing campsites or follow some very clear leave no trace camping rules. But when you're in parks, and let's concentrate on parks, and then we'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages of those, and then go on to crown land, because I think that's the process most people do. Most people will start in the parks and then kind of end up maybe doing a combination, but they'll do a lot more crown land or public land camping areas. So starting off with a park, generally you have to register, probably pre-book. So right now, I believe I heard in Nova Scotia, for instance, Keji is now accepting bookings in March. So if they start on March 15th, by March 15th, 7:05, most of the sites are going to be gone. If the last few years are any indication, within the first 15, 20 minutes, the majority of weekends and days are already booked. And then you're into the game of looking for people canceling. You can usually still get some on good weekends. You just have to be
a little less picky about which weekends you go to.
Yeah. Beauty of it, you show up to a campsite. Generally, there's wood at the campsite or at a location you can go get it. So if you're still backwoods camping, which is our preference, I mean, you can do frontwoods or type camping, and that's That's usually you can drive up to it with your car.
Hmm.
There's more facilities. There's usually a washroom facility, maybe a canteen you can buy stuff in. It's really nice, and it's more of a social thing. You're not getting far back, and you can usually pay for wood in those locations.
What I usually call that, for a better analogy, it's kind of like trailer park camping. It's like living in a trailer park, but with tents. Everybody's
Yeah.
usually pretty close by, but you do have a feel of privacy. But like you said, generally you got utilities there. Generally, there's going to be a community gathering area, like a community fire pit or something like that. Generally, there's going to be some sort of cooking stuff there. At least in our neck of the woods, there is. Like you can get little. They're basically like campsite fireplaces or fireboxes that have
Yes.
grills on top of them and stuff like that. They have a lot of nice amenities coming into them, and that is one of the big advantages of these things. It's definitely good for that in between, somebody that's on shore but maybe going out into the woods. And we've said this in past podcasts. If you are on the fence there, or you know somebody that's go on the fence, because let's face it, as bushcrafters, we typically introduce a lot of people into the woods. We are generally going to be the people that other people come to when they have questions about going camping or gear and stuff like that. So it's a great way to introduce these people in without putting a whole lot of stress on top of them about the walking into the woods. Is their gear going to be 100% correct? You know, all the stuff that goes into camping in the woods, but still gives you a nice feel off it because I mean, our campsites here, they're pretty private. I mean, you can hear other people around you. You're not out of earshot, but generally you have a nice little cluster of woods to kind of carve out and call your own that'll still give you the feel if there's trees around you, but generally it's nice and flat for you to set your stuff up on. If you're more into car camping, RV camping, and stuff like that, a lot of these places will tailor to that too.
Um, a general rule of thumb, and there's no guarantee with that. The provincial and federal campsites generally give you a little bit more privacy than you will on a private site. There are some really good private campsites out there. So before someone comes in and rips me a complete new one, um, I have camped a lot in a pretty well every one. I have been in probably most campsites in Atlantic Canada at one point or time or another. And I usually use when I was still trailer camping or car camping. I usually use provincial and and federal campsites like national parks because I found them more private. I had a dog, I had better separation, it caused a lot less problems with noise and issues. That was the reason I preferred them. There were some private ones I really liked. Keep that in mind when you're booking them. You have to kind of know the area. Some of them definitely subscribe to what I love to call sardine camping. And this is where you literally can reach out and touch your neighbor.
Yeah. And I guess just to interject a quick point in there, because RSA or Red Sand Adventures, another YouTuber there, um, they asked here, are we talking about national parks or camping parks? And I guess just to clarify at the moment, for anybody out there that's wondering, there is two kind of classifications of parks when it comes to like Nova Scotia and a lot of the Atlantic provinces and stuff like that. Well, actually three technically, but you get like what we would call a camping park. That's going to be your Porter's Lake, Stoller Lakes, things like that. They're a camping park. They're made for specifically camping. And then you'll get like national parks or provincial parks, which would
Which is
be
your edge
like
or your highlands.
Kejimakaji. You can still camp on these parks, but generally you're into booking the sites. They fill up fast, and you're probably not going to drive right up to them. There's like the park is more for walking and scenery and stuff like that. And the campsites that come onto these parks are generally going to be booked up by the more quote unquote hardcore campers, maybe not, or bushcrafters, stuff like that. Like you're a little more in depth into the camping field than if you were going to a camping park.
And if you go on the national, so Canada has a national parks website. You can go on to it. We're not going to give you the link, but you can find it easy enough. Just search National Parks Canada, and you'll find them. They have a booking site, and they have front country and back country. And the back country is the ones you walk to, you canoe to, you bike to, you hike to. There's a way back to them. Front country, you can still drive up to them, very much like our provincial campsites with more amenities. What are the advantages? Let's just sort of get that through. Generally, you have access to wood, a fire pit, bear bags when you're in the back country, when you're in the front country, canteens, things like that. And there's usually like signage, so it's easier to get around. Like the trails are well marked. There's oftentimes information signs, so if you get to an area, you may actually be able to find some information on that. There's pamphlets. There's a lot to it. It's a very good experience. It's oftentimes a very educational experience. The downside, you generally cannot cut any wood.
No.
Bringing
And that's the big one that a lot of people overlook. They're like, oh, I'll just cut a little wood while I'm there. Most parks, if not all parks, do not want you cutting down the trees and stuff for firewood or to use for your campsite. Like they want everything kind of left as is
yeah,
when you pull in. So you have to pretty much take everything you want or purchase it while you're there. And that's why a lot of these backcountry campsites, they have like side by sides and stuff like that, and they'll run out some firewood to try and deter people from cutting the foliage and stuff like that around them.
now like the last few times I went to Keji, and I like Keji. It's a beautiful park. I've done a lot of camping in there. They've actually made some of the campsites. There is a pile of like a woodlot area there where you can pick up wood. You don't cut it, but it's all piled there. But if that's empty, the drop off site could be miles away, literally. Like you may have to canoe, and I think one of them is Corbell Lake and Mountain Lake. You actually have to paddle from one lake to the next, pretty well as far away as possible from the site I really liked to the woodlot, and then paddle all the way back. Which, if you had a hard day getting to your site, is not top of your list. So keep that in mind. You are kind of restricted, yeah, in that stuff. You're also set sites even to where you can put your tent out. There's pads, and you expect it to put your tent on the pad. If you find out you're not, you can be asked to leave. I don't know if anyone's been fined for it. And they may not be overly appreciative of things like hammocks. Difference, you really have to look this up before you go in. Some have a rule against hammocks. They also have a rule against drones. So if you're going to document your adventure and you want to share it with your friends, you may not be able to throw a drone up and get a nice aerial shot of what you did.
So just on that note, all
Yeah.
national parks and or yeah, all national parks in Canada are no fly drone zones. Now,
Which
provincial parks, check your local regulations.
which honestly was a hindrance to me. When we bought our drone, we pushed it off for a year and a half because our goal was to document some of our trips and we really wanted to use it. And the place we wanted to go first was Keji because there's beautiful spots and there's shots you just can't get any other way. And and to me, that was a big disappointment, a big hit to what I want to do, to the type of camping I do and the enjoyment I get out of some of this stuff. So keep that in mind. The restrictions in the parks are much greater than outside of the parks. That does not mean there's no restrictions outside of the park. But what advantage it gives you is when you park your vehicle there, it's probably going to be safe when you come back to get it. There's less likely that someone's going to break into your car. There's security people there. If you do have problems, there's help for you. It's not going to be as bad. But keep in mind, you are restricted.
Yeah. So the real short way to sum it up is when you go to a park, be it camping, national, whatever, you're playing by their rules. So just as long as you see what their rules are, they're generally pretty easy to stay within. But
Yeah.
realize that you are playing by their rules.
And know them before you get there. If you show up with, for example, a wood stove, so if you're planning on burning small amounts of wood to fuel your cooking sets, and they say no fires, it's no fires. You have no options, and they may insist you carry a canister stove or a certain type of stove. They can be restrictive down to that. There may be rules on the type of cooking you can do, where you can go, when you can go. The beauty of it is they do keep the areas pretty well clutter free. So if they're usually very clean, you don't find much garbage in the parks. The other thing is you won't have to worry about when you show up to the camping area, someone else being there because you've booked it and it's pretty clear. And there's nobody going to be really close. Backcountry campsites are pretty isolated from each other, meaning that you can expect a relatively good level of privacy in the backcountry. You don't have to worry about sharing your site with someone else or uh, having a lot of people there all the time. Now, during the day, If your campsite happens to be on a portage route, yes, expect 15, 20 people might go through in that day. But at night, as things kind of wind down, most likely you're going to be in your site and without any interference, or so that's nice, right? Um, yeah, so that's kind of the things. Generally cleaner, a lot more rules. Now, do you want to? Can we pivot now to backcountry, or do you want to add?
No, I think we pretty much covered it there. Like I said, just once again, quickly sum it up before we step away from it to try and recap.
Yeah.
With parks, it's a great gateway, but there's rules that you have to follow. So if you are somebody that is limited on gear, potentially, and not exclusively, don't misunderstand, but potentially, if you have mobility issues or something like that where you'd rather stay closer to your vehicle, it's another good option that's going to give you a lot of the niceties you would find in the woods. The only flip side of that is in the provincial parks here, you would mention that sometimes they won't let you burn. On the flip side of that, in Nova Scotia, if there's a burn ban on, that doesn't necessarily include the provincial parks. Sometimes you'll
Yeah.
see a provincial burn ban on, go into like Dollar Lake or Porter's Lake, something like that, and they're handing you firewood saying, oh, yeah, you can still burn in here because the park actually follows a different set of rules for that.
Yeah.
But likewise, you may have a burn ban in the park and none out in the province. So you just got to check the signage when you're going in.
One of the things I did find with, say, the provincial parks is where they have their own fire pits that they expect you to use, and they bring their own wood that they expect you to use. They do restrict fires less frequently. With the private campsites, they follow the provincial rules. So I have literally bought wood from them, got back to my site, and they called me up and said, "Nope, no fires tonight. There's a burn ban." And I'm like, I just gave you $10 for wood," and they're like, "Yeah." And my wife, she would pack that wood home. One interesting thing is provincial parks request that you do not bring wood onto the site from outside. So they expect you to buy the wood there. And they discourage people from bringing wood from home because they're worried about insect cross-contamination. And I have my own thoughts on that, but we'll leave that as a controversy. And if anyone wants to chat with me about it, just give me a call. We'll go camping, and we can chat all night around a fire about this.
And it is a fair point. That is a good thing to mention. They don't want you bringing firewood. And that's to any, the provincial, the national, any of those parks. They don't want you taking firewood in.
Yeah. So once you go outside of that, and this is generally, if I would say, for your more intermediate or advanced people. So if you're camping outside of the provincial, federal campsites, or even private campsites, a few things to know. There's no guarantee. You can't book a site. It's first come, first serve. And that's a courtesy. There's nothing stopping people from staying in the same area as you or setting their tent right up next to you. And you really have no legal backing there. So if you show up and somebody else shows up and says, "I'm camping here tonight too," and you're kind of stuck with them unless you're willing to move. Like you've lost that sort of protection. Now I've seen people in the national parks. I talked to a friend one time. They told me a story. They were camping at a site. People were walking through. It was fairly late. They seemed absolutely exhausted and said, "Do you mind if we stay at your site tonight? Because we don't want to walk the extra mile and a half to the next site." And so, can it happen? Yes. But it's very rare in the parks. It's not common, but it can happen, and you have really very little recourse. Fortunately, oftentimes you meet similar type people, and it's really going to be a good time either way. So if it happens, I would roll with it personally. You are less restricted on cutting wood. Now, I say that, but use common sense. If you are in backcountry, crown type land, do know your rules and stuff. There may be rules against it. Do be very careful that you're leaving like no trace camping. Don't leave fire rings everywhere. Don't leave the ashes. Take care of what you're doing. But if you are to cut something down, standing dead or fallen dead is your much preferable firewood than anything else. Do not kill live trees. Um, and I've rarely been in a situation where I couldn't find enough standing dead or fallen trees that I couldn't
Hmm.
get what I needed. So um, it shouldn't be a problem. Just be aware that it's a thing, right? Um, the trails paths to get to where you want to go may be all but invisible or completely grown over. There are groups, like there is the kayak and canoe Nova Scotia or something along those lines. I should know this. I'm kind of a member. um, but they have a program where they go and clear portage routes and stuff. So there are people working on it, but it's volunteer and partially subsidized by the government when they're really lucky. But it's hard work for those groups, and they're always looking for volunteers. If anyone's really into it and looking for an experience, reach out to those guys. I reached out about a year and a half ago, and promptly ended up with a job offer in BC and never got to do much with them. I'm disappointed in that. I still get their emails and I hear about the trips they're taking, and and it sounds really cool. And they send trip reports saying that they've got this far in this trail and this work still needs to be done. Um, so thank groups like that. But yeah, with that stuff, you're really going to want to get up on your map and compass. Make sure you understand navigational skills, or you're not going far from your car, because it doesn't take long to get yourself into trouble. A lot of these areas are some of the nicest in the world. There's the Tobiatic and Tangier in Nova Scotia that I've camped in both of them a little bit. And, the Tobiatic, I think, is right there by Keji. It encompasses Keji. So Tangier, I think, is closer to Halifax, or it's vice versa. I get them mixed up sometimes. But I think I'm right on that. Those are beautiful, large areas that you can camp. And when I've camped in there, I've often seen other people. I've met people. We've oftentimes stopped while portaging and said, "Hey, how's it going? Where are you going to? What sites did you visit? Were there any issues?" And it's been really good. Some of the portages and trails will have logbooks where you can kind of log when you went in and when you go out. And it really helps people coming behind you, because then they'll kind of know if they should expect somebody back there. One of the ones I went to, there's a cabin south of the airport where you can actually, it's first come, first serve. Whoever shows up can go in and stay the night. We stopped and checked the logbook and seen that there was no one there, but that's not a guarantee. Someone could be coming from the opposite direction. They're not going to get to the logbook. They'll get to it after the fact, right? So there's two ways to hit any point back there. So there's no guarantees, but if there is that. Other disadvantage, oftentimes there's nowhere secure to park your vehicle, so you're literally leaving your vehicle in the middle of the woods on the side of a road. That makes a lot of people nervous. It makes my wife nervous, and that's one of the reasons she's often resisted some of these trips, because she's like, well, what happens if they tow our vehicle, or what if someone comes and breaks into it? You really don't know. I've never had an issue. Out here in BC, I'm hearing a lot of talk with people who had their catalytic converters cut out doing that. So there is that. If you could convince somebody to drop you off and pick you up, could be a good advantage to some of those, right?
Sorry, I was just answering some comments over there. A little bit of a conversation happened in the comments, and I was just kind of waiting to bring it into here because we haven't moved up to Crown Land yet. But RSA, I am not ignoring you. I will address this here in a minute, because PEI is a little bit of an odd bird there. And we'll talk about that in a second.
Okay.
But yeah, so with the backwoods camping, like Ben said, it's kind of your next step from, front woods camping or local camping or camping parks, whatever you want to say there. And that's where you get a little bit more adventurous. And honestly, a lot of bushcrafters and stuff will use that too, because they don't have to try and find a patch of ground land to go and set up. And seeing we're talking about that now, and the conversation in the comments is going there a little bit. So why don't we talk a little bit about Crown Land now? We kind of talked about parks, both the types you can get into and do a little camping. There is some definite advantages there. There is some disadvantages. So when you're talking crown land, generally in Canada and a lot of other places, crown land, depending on how much, what we call the crown owns, but it's no longer the crown, how much the province owns, it's pretty free for the public to use in the purposes of camping as long as you're not erecting a permanent or semi-permanent structure. And that kind of becomes a gray area, is what's a semi-permanent structure, because a tent can be argued to be a semi-permanent structure, but it doesn't fall under this for the terms of this conversation. That's a whole other conversation, and feel free to get into your lawyer talk and debate that all you want. Tons of forums on that. But generally, the big thing is it's free. You know what I mean? And it's usually public land you're able to go in and do your thing with. Now, what we were talking about here in the comments is Prince Edward Island here in not Nova Scotia, in Canada. It's kind of a little bit of an exception simply because they don't have the vast amount of public land. And in the comments they're talking about, like, maybe with public land, it might be parking lots and stuff like that. No, when PEI mentions public land, they're talking about provincially owned land. They call it public land, and they generally don't do crown land camping or public land camping in PEI simply because they don't have they can't support it. Honestly, there's just not enough room. Prince Edward Island's a fairly small province. It's a little tricky, and they don't have the means to manage that kind of stuff. So yeah, PEI being the oddball out on this one. I definitely think you should call the renewable resources there and get a little bit more information on that. Because memory seems to serve there is locations where you can do some camping, but you have to find out where they are, much like the national parks. And you got to, make sure that you're accepted to go in there at the time. So definitely call them, get some better answers. I do know that it is a little bit more of a trickier province, simply just because it's small and it's an island.
Yeah, and even when I first got to Nova Scotia, finding the crown land was a lot harder for me at first, because unfortunately they don't instantly put it up on the maps and stuff. Sometimes you have to do some research to find out what's crown land, what's not, where you need permission, where do you not. It takes some work. Newfoundland for me was the simplest I've ever been in. 90% of the land is crown, so it's really easy there. Other provinces vary from location to location, but yeah, it's really important to look up those things and figure it out. But once you figure it out, it is pretty good.
And just to peer behind the veil a little bit from that, and granted, my information is slightly outdated. Haven't worked for natural resources in almost 10 years now. But for Nova Scotia specifically, the Crown or the province always has to own somewhere between 12 and 14% of the property out there. Nova Scotia being bigger, a certain percentage of that has to remain as on-touch property as well. So we get places here like Trafalgar and stuff like that where it's considered, wildlife sanctuaries and stuff like that. They don't really like you going in and messing stuff up. Can't hunt there. They don't really want you camping there, stuff like that. It's on-touched area. PEI, once again, I think it's 90% of the province is privately owned, so they're like 10%. And out of that, they still got to do like their wildlife acquisition planning, their PCT cut clearing and stuff like that. So it becomes very condensed and hard to allow public camping in there, because if you are camping in there, you might be screwing up somebody's wildlife acquisition plan or replant or something like that, right? It's just trickier. But yeah, in Nova Scotia and larger provinces, not so much a problem because they can still have that untouched land and yada, yada, yada. Anyway, 2 cents on that. Like I said, 10-year-old information, could be changed a little bit, but once upon a time, that's what it was based on. So, yeah, Red Sand, you might want to look into a provincial park. Your situation's also a gray area. I don't really want to get into it too much over the podcast, but you know what? Shoot me a message on Facebook and we can chat a little bit in private message there, and I'll tell you my thoughts on that.
One thing that you probably could get away with in PEI, because I think this is more universal, you generally cannot own land below the high water mark on the ocean, lakes, things like that. Now, I've heard New Brunswick may have an exception to that. So if people on both sides of the river, they actually own that section of river for fishing rights, and they will get quite violent to protect that. But for the most part, so if nowhere else, you can often walk up a beach, and as long as it's not right in front of someone's house, you can safely park there without harassment for a night or two. If you start setting up long term, expect more problems. Keep in mind too that there are things called tides, and they make life really miserable.
When you were in Nova Scotia, you there was an incident not far from you where somebody bunked down for the night and woke up floating away.
Yes, that was a very interesting story. A guy was going to Cape Breton, I believe. He was doing it on a motorcycle. He got close to Truro, decided, man, I'm tired. I want to get a nap. So he left after work. It was already late when he left. He pulled in, apparently, and I remember the article. He said he forgot to taste the grass, something he does. And had he done it, he would have noticed that the grass was very salty because he literally camped on the Fundy Bay, and the tide came in, and I think he was already 6-7 inches underwater by the time he woke up, and which doesn't take long in the Bay of Fundy. Anyone thinking, what a fool. And he kind of indicated his tent kind of floated. He was still dry, but the ground underneath him was moving a lot, and he had to walk back to his vehicle and continue on, and I think he may have lost some gear. So
She's been eyeballing me for the last 5 minutes, so I figured I'd finally pet her. But yeah, kind of an interesting story. You can definitely find it if you just search the news or Google or something like that. It's definitely worth a read. I think we might have posted it up back on the page back in the day it happened. But kind of looping back, coming back to Crown Land here, keep us a little bit on track before my voice goes out. Yeah, generally it's free for most of Canada. For most of Canada, you're allowed to stay up to 21 days. And you can check out like the actual Canada website. This is where I grabbed this information from. Generally, you're allowed up to 21 days in a tent or a camping environment. After that, they kind of want you to move on because the length that you're staying there could be impacting the environment a noticeable amount. Like where it's not going to bounce back as easy, and you could have to come in and do a little bit of, agriculture or something on that.
And I've heard some lower numbers in certain locations, but there is a trend that they don't want you to stay long term, but you can do a few nights usually pretty safely. 21, I've heard a week in some places, 2 weeks. All these are numbers that are not uncommon.
And that's the thing. Just because that's the legal amount, don't go in there planning to stay 21 days. You know what I mean? Yeah. Be nice about it. Maybe somebody else wants to move in another area, because if you're camped up at a location, you don't know if somebody happened to be walking down thinking of the same location. This happens sometimes at the waterfall location that Ben and I originally camped at. Only a handful of people know it, but it does happen occasionally where you'll be there, you'll be camping, or more specifically, you'll be walking in and you will hear somebody that's already set up at the camp at the bottom of the hill. The courtesy is you just kind of go, okay, today's not my day, and you either go find somewhere else or you come back a different weekend is generally what it is. So don't stay for weeks on end and try to monopolize an area. That's the thing with Crown Land camping and any of that. You have to acknowledge it is everybody's. As we're at a campground, you can own that site for as long as you want to pay for it. If you want to pay for every single day of the summer, they'd be more than happy to take your money and give it to you. Crown Land, it's a courtesy thing.
That being said, you know that most provincial and federal campsites have a limit.
Oh, I didn't know that at all.
Yeah, they won't allow you seasonal camping. So you usually can only book for so many nights, and then they expect you to move. Now, you can move to the next site, but they won't let you book too long. Just keep that in mind. Private campgrounds work much differently. A lot of them are more than happy to accept you as seasonal. In fact, the seasonal sites are actually competed for, and once you get them, some people will not give them up for years. And some of those private campgrounds may still keep 4 or 5 sites that are for visitors, but not seasonal, and that those are ones they will not rent out seasonally, but the majority they may do. And it's just a system that exists there. But I don't think those are the type of places that bushcrafters are looking for. Bushcrafters, the people that I assume are watching our show, they're looking for something a bit more primitive, a bit more experimental.
And that is kind of what you're going to be getting in the Crown Land thing. Like, the big benefit to Crown Land for me is it is a disconnect. There's generally nobody else around you. Most of the places I go, cell phones don't work. You're not getting street lights. It's usually the most peaceful, tranquil, dark at night places. And when I say dark, it's like even if you're on a hill, you can look around and you're not going to see street lights in the distance. Those are the kind of places I try to go for, like complete disconnect. And if that's what you're looking for, that's generally what you're going to get with Crown Land camping. Very few
Yeah.
people be going into the same area unless it's a common area or something like that. Even in the backwoods camping in the national parks, there's generally a trail nearby, and there's nothing to stop maybe the park maintenance crew from driving by at some point, kind of ruining the immersion. As we're out in the woods, you generally aren't going to get that unless you're close to ATV trails, and we've told stories about that in the past where you may not have noticed you parked up next to a trail or something, but that's just luck of the draw. But if you're doing, everything goes right, you are off grid, like you are gone.
And I can't stress enough that yes, you can go back, you can explore. The likelihood of seeing anyone is pretty slim, but I can't stress enough the leave no trace
Hmm.
system. Um, it's kind of been a problem I've seen on forums and things where people went back and they built their little bushcraft camp. So they built a semi-permanent lean-to. They built maybe like ones with walls. They have multiple ceilings. They go back to it some tarps and put roofs on them. And for you, that may look awesome, cool, and it is. Like I'm not taken away from that. Uh, when you leave at the end of the trip, all that should be dispersed. Everything should be taken down. The tarp should be taken out and brought home with you. None of that should be left there. And that's the problem is when you leave it there and someone else comes to see, they don't see the cool job you did or the hard work you put in it. They see it as being filthy and disgusting. And they complain. And they will complain to your government officials. They will complain to the police. They will complain to anyone who'll listen. And some of them will just rip it down out of anger. And the problem is that creates animosity between our groups because those of us that put the effort into building them, we took a lot of pride. We were planning on coming back and doing time and experimenting with that. But for someone else who wants to come back and see a non-touched wilderness, this takes away from that from them. So if you want to do that stuff, you really need to find private land. And that's a whole nother thing. It's not impossible. Go talk to the owner of maybe a woodlot and tell him what you want to do, and he may be, yeah, do it. Keeps nuisance people out of his area.
And the other side of that is they may say no, no, thank you, in which case you need to respect that as well.
100%, right? It's not impossible to find. I've had a couple of offers over the years where people said, listen, I'm going to be doing something back there in 5 years. In the meantime, if you want to use it, go ahead. That's an awesome offer. Don't expect it. And I think expecting too much really can create another bit of a nuisance. I see some notes in here about the vehicles because I mentioned.
So that I was just about to say, Steve points out one of the biggest drawbacks to Crown Land camping. It's a little trickier with your vehicles. Generally, you're going to be walking into these locations. It's really hard to find a drive-up camp spot that's in Crown Land unless you're camping directly off a road where, once again, you're going to have the potential of somebody going down it. This happens a lot with logging roads. People find logging roads, think they're shut down. They go in, they set up beside it, only to wake up in the morning with a logging crew coming in or something like that, right? And then you're because that does happen. It could be posted as Crown Land, but what Crown does is sell the stumpage on that land. As long as the company has a silviculture plan in place, it's pretty common practice. So just because it's Crown Land, don't think it's not going to be logged. There is a certain amount, and I mean, this is another debate, and I won't get into that, but for wall or regulation or whatever you want to call it, money making, the Crown will sell off the stumpage of the wood. That way they make a little money on it. They also trade land off. So what was Crown Land today may not be Crown Land tomorrow. And I've seen a lot of deals like that go down where somebody may trade off like, I'm just going to pull some random numbers, like 100 acres off pre-harvested but replanted wood acreage for maybe 40 acres of untouched land that used to be Crown, and they'll swap that and do the paperwork up. So there is some things in there you got to be aware of that you may not see. That stuff doesn't get publicly posted. So it is worth scouting out and seeing if anybody else happened to be in there doing some scouting around. There's usually telltale signs if you keep your eyes peeled, and you can generally figure that stuff out. But yeah, you're not going to get cars in there. And as Steve said, it's going to be trickier to take more people. Like if you want to take the family in his instance here, if they want it to car camp, you definitely have to do a little pre-scouting. Make sure your vehicle can make it to where you want to go. You're not going to get hung up. It's also going to be, you're generally going to be driving in deeper on kept roads. So it may look fine from the road, and then a kilometer in, you realize it turns to nothing. And you don't want to push yourself beyond where you may get stuck and not be able to come out. You're going to be running into spots where you're not going to get turnarounds. I've done this. I have a bad habit of I'll just be driving along, see a logging road, and go, hey, I wonder where that goes, and drive in for like 10 kilometers just to realize I now have to basically back out 10 kilometers. So
Yeah.
all these things are things to kind of keep in mind.
So I've done a fair bit of this. There are, I think they oftentimes call them fire roads. If you can keep an eye out on maps for that, fire roads are oftentimes roads that go through private and public land. So you have to be somewhat careful of that and go back and know what you're doing. But like you said, it could be people logging back there. It could be people hunting back there. It could be all kinds of activities back there. Do be somewhat careful with them. But you can get some really cool spots. I found awesome sites. Some that are accessible by your vehicle, some that aren't. Some that at best you can park your vehicle there, and that's your base point for a long hike or canoe trip.
And the other advantage, which we mentioned as a disadvantage on the other side, is you typically are allowed to bring your drones and stuff like that.
Yeah, you get away with stuff like that. And the drone in this case becomes a very powerful tool. And by that I mean you show up with your drone, and now you can use that to scout ahead. You can find some cool spots, and kind of get an idea of where you're going. Again, you won't necessarily find a pre-made campsite, or when you do find them, this is an unfortunate thing. Oftentimes they're a state. People have left bags of chips, tin cans, broken glass. I highly encourage anyone who goes back to these sites, leave them in better shape than you found them. Ideally, I tell you, bring them back to pristine condition, but the reality is I know that that's not always within your capabilities. You're going back there with a truck full of gear. You may not have room to go back with 4 or 5 garbage bags of stuff you didn't bring. At least bring your garbage back, and if possible, bring some of what you find there, or at least dispose of it in a better way. My last trip I went out, I found an entire giant piece of foam from a mattress. There was a tent with all the poles left there in a location I would have used. In fact, I did, and I had to relocate a lot of the stuff to a spot, but I definitely did not have room to pack that on my vehicle and drag it out, which was unfortunate because I still think I left the site in better shape than I found it, but it was disappointing that I still left a lot of garbage back there that I did not bring, and I could not get it out. So do try to keep these things in better shape, because like I said, if we go back there and we make a mess and we make a state, it's only a matter of time before the people from the government look at it and say, well, the people aren't taking care of it. They don't like it. And then people complain. If they have to spend time or resources to clean those areas up, they will go in. They will block off roads. They will restrict it, or they will just sell it for commercial use.
And you see that a lot happening around here now is decommissioned roads. Generally, it's you look over, the road looks good, but they've dug it out and kind of make like a deep gully so you can't get through it anymore. A lot more of that is going on nowadays simply because of these reasons. People are going back there and they're dumping garbage. And not just when they're camping. They're taking like truckloads of stuff and just pushing it off into the woods. And this is very unfortunate.
And I think it's an indication of a lot of stuff, and we don't want to get political in here, but the reality is maybe it's getting too expensive, too difficult to dump stuff. But the fact that people went back and did that is obviously greatly wrong. And I love to see an end to it, because it's disappointing when you go way back and you still find the Vienna sausage cans and the Tim Hortons cups and the McDonald's plates and all this other garbage that has no business in the backwoods to begin with, being just tossed around left, right, and center. And it makes it's bad for the animals, it's bad for us, it's bad for the environment. It shouldn't happen. But So
moving
again,
on to some of the benefits. Now we talked, a little spiel in there that might turn some people off. Like we said, it's very private. 2, you have a lot more freedom to do what you want. And I mean, I'm going to be stretching the boundaries here. But, for whatever reason, if you want to come out of your tent stark naked, you're going to get away with that a lot better on Crown land than in a camping park. I can guarantee you that. Less fines attached to it, you know.
I've never been fined for that in any park.
In any, oh yeah, yeah. But no, realistically, you do have a lot more freedom. You like if you are more adventurous stuff like that, more exhibition-y, whatever your case may be. I don't judge. You are going to get that better in a Crown Land Institute, and you're going to get away with more things that if you want to bring some toys to tinker with, like we bring new equipment and stuff like that. If we want to test something out, you got a lot more freedom to do that because you can set up multiple campsites, if that makes any kind of sense. And it's not really a multiple campsite, it's you're just setting up separate kind of things around your normal campsite, where in a camping park you're going to get a little crowded because your campsite is limited literally by what they give you, and that is your area and you can't go outside that. Crown Land, the sky is the limit within reason. Realize the bigger you make your site, the more you have to clean up when you leave, which is what we all just talked about, so keep that in mind. But you have the freedom to do that. You also have the freedom to pick where you want to be out of like almost an infinite number of possibilities, versus you get to pick out of maybe 25 possible locations at your local camping park. If you want to go to the other side of the lake, you can do that. You want to be on this side, you can do that. Like it literally becomes more in your own control, I guess.
And a good example of that is like I've done trips in Keji, and when you do the trip in Keji, the thing you do is you go on and you say, okay, I'm back there for 5 days. I want to do 5 different sites, so I'm going to hit this one, this one, this one, and this one. And then you get there and the weather goes bad, and you could end up working like a dog to make it the distance, or maybe the site you ideally wanted wasn't available, so now you need to go to the next one, so you're doing more distance in one day than you wanted, but it's the only ones available and you really want to do the trip, so now you've committed to it. On Crown Land, you head in. If all of a sudden you don't feel as good, or if you don't think it's working out the way you want it, you take that extra day. You just set up camp where you weren't planning, and it doesn't matter. You're not going to get penalized or anything for it, right? So that's the beautiful thing about that. But I think if the wardens in Keji found out you camped somewhere where you weren't supposed to, they may come and evict you. They may actually come in and tell you you have to leave. This isn't okay, and I think you can even be fined for that, unless you can prove it was like a life or death situation.
Yeah,
thing.
and there is survival conditions onto that, and that's a whole other thing with a lot of legal backings. Which, once again, if you want to chat about that, we'll go camping and chat about that, because that's going to be a lot of real weird gray areas. But I guess a prime point to point out now is not all parks are camping parks. And the one that comes to mind is Sheet Harbor. It is what is considered a day park. And that's another type of provincial park that we have here. And that means you can go in for the day. At a certain point, that park has become closed. And I know in my career with natural resources, I have had to go in and ask people to leave these parks that we're trying to camp overnight. In the parking lot is one thing, generally still frowned upon, but sometimes they have rules in there for campers. They're allowed to stay for a night or whatever if they're traveling through. But camping, like they would go down the trails and then find a spot and set up, not always 100% in your parks. So once again, just check around.
And a lot of those are gated, and they'll say, like, at 8 o'clock or at dusk, we lock the gate. And they don't want anyone on the other side, because what if something happens? There's a legal responsibility there. So it's gated because they don't want people going back to partying or getting hurt or injured. There's no supervision. There's no protection, and it's not meant for that.
Well, little story on this. Once again, people that were there that shouldn't have been there. Somebody rolled an ankle. We had to get a helicopter, one of the natural resources helicopters, to fly in and pick that person up and get them out. That was the only means of egress. It was a hover entrance, hover exit. So once again, huge liabilities on that. Not to mention that I think it was the 212 at the time. That thing's $2,000 an hour to keep in the air. So a lot of cost involved in this stuff too, right?
Yeah. And honestly, not all national parks have the same options too. I do not believe there is much in the way of backcountry camping in the Highlands, which is unfortunate because I love the Highlands. There's only a couple of sites, I believe. Fishing Cove is one of them, which is...
They are posted. Once again, there's literature, and you can pull that. We did grab one because we were planning to do some trails before COVID all went to snot. But yeah, It's not everywhere.
No. But even within that area, just outside of the park, there is crown land that you can camp at, and I've hunted a lot of that. So the other thing to keep in mind, a lot of the crown land is available for hunting. So you have to look at the designation. If it's a wildlife reserve, then at that point you can't go camp. You can't go hunting, so it's probably safer to go camping in the fall. In a lot of crown land, it's hunting available, and for a lot of hunters, it's the only land available to them. So they are hunting there, and they may even be camping there. But if you want to camp in the fall when the leaves are beautiful and you think this is an awesome time to get out, you may find that the traffic goes up a lot, and the type of traffic may not be to your liking. There may be a lot of bang bangs and a lot of trucks bouncing up and down the roads when you wouldn't really expect it. So you get probably about 10 months, maybe even 11 months of the year where you can go back there pretty well unharassed by anything, but there is a month or two where you have to be aware that other people are using it for various tasks.
Yep.
And they may not have the same ideas that you have.
No, very true. And once again, I mean, it sounds like a very short list for crown land. The biggest attractions are the freedom. In all honesty, you have the freedom to go where you want, to go in as deep as you want, to walk as far as you want, and to set up where you want.
And the price is right.
And it's free. That's the second big factor. For all intents and purposes, it makes way more sense to go camping in a park if you take freedom out of the question. If you're just looking to go sleep on the ground and have a campfire, parks make 100% more sense on paper. But it is the absolute sense of freedom that going out in the middle of nowhere, setting up your own little fire, listening to it crackle at night while you stare off into the stars, which honestly, they seem so much brighter when you're so far away from everything. Everything just seems nicer, for lack of a better explanation. We did an episode back on there, the therapeutic nature of bushcrafting. Go back, listen to that. That's all true.
So just to throw in there, I know you kind of swung it one way, and I don't disagree with you. For me, crown land camping is the best. Nature reserve camping, whatever you want to call it. And I like it because of two things. I don't have to pre-book it. I got so frustrated over the last few years trying to book the right sites in the national parks. And I got so frustrated with the pricing policies because you pay for park entry, you pay for the campsite, you're restricted in what you can do, and it became a stressor for me. It came to a point where I actually dreaded the thought of it. And I have good friends who love that camping more than anything, and they call me like, "Let's go do this," and I'm like, "Do I have to?" And I have a friend, I would consider him a good friend. I have a good friend who flat out refuses to camp in a camping park. He does crown land only because he also, like me, is almost fed up with it.
That's pretty much me. I almost, unless it's for something like a gathering or an event, I refuse to pay to camp because it is such a rigmarole to try and do it.
It's getting prohibitive. Like if you really look at some of the costs, I mean, if you do it as much as us, there's a savings there. But if you're only doing it once or twice a year, and you're now buying, say, a $200 tent, which is at best mid-range, $100 for your sleeping bag, $50-$60 for your air mattress, backpack that's worth $100, your stove that's probably anywhere between $50 and $150, and all this stuff. You add up all this price of the gear, and then to pay $60 a night, you can get a hell of a lot of nights in a hotel, or like rent a cabin in the woods for the price of what you would spend for a couple of nights camping and buying all the gear that you're not using very often.
No, for sure. And don't get me wrong, that is another viable option, maybe for another podcast. Cabin camping is great. Steve and I went and did some cabin camping just before, I think it was just before Christmas. Yeah, it was just before Christmas. And that's a whole other thing. We had a lot of fun out there, too.
Yeah. I mean, I love the cabin camping. I love the backwoods camping. I love a lot of these things. And some cabins are free if you know where they're to and you know the arrangements. they do exist, not everywhere, but just know that they do sometimes exist. And if you know how to get them, that's great. Um, so there's a lot of options out there. Is one better than the other? Absolutely not. It's figure out what works for you. We're definitely not telling you not to do one or the other. Be
Whatever
aware.
method you take to get out there and enjoy the wilderness is perfect. Um, but that being said, like I said, there is some ups and downs of both. We figured we'd give you a little bit of a, kind of our insight on it. Both Ben and I do very little campground camping, as we mentioned. Even though I said on paper it makes more sense, I far prefer the freedom of being out there, seeing the new sites. That's the other thing with Crown Land is you can choose how much you want to see. You can go to a location you've never seen before and camp, as if you're going to a camping park. Even if you've only been to one or two of the sites, by the time you're done driving around and finding your site, you've pretty much seen the majority of the park. Or while you're there, you're probably going to walk around and see the park, and then, there's not really a whole lot more to see. But as Ben mentioned, it's a lot more of a social gathering in parks. So it's tip for tap. You know what I mean? Each one serves a purpose and it does it very well in its own right. Just figure out what works for you. And if you kind of walk that picket fence, you can get into like the national parks and you can kind of go in a little deeper or stay out a little more. Like there's tons of options out there. You just got to see what fits your need and what makes you happy.
Yeah. I did. I had the pop up camper for years. We did, I think, every provincial park in the province and most of the private ones. Some of them I absolutely loved, some that we started doing very regularly. The beauty of that was for us, we got to set it up. We didn't ever worry too much about leaving gear at the site. We could explore areas, so we got to visit communities and towns nearby. We got to hang out at beaches with other people. It was social. It was very fun. When I wanted to do more primitive stuff, it came to the back country camping. That's where I kind of went to from there. And then I found friends who knew a lot more about the crown land camping, and I got to do a lot of that. And they're the things I want to warn you about. If you're going to do that stuff, the maps are not going to be clear. The sites may or may not even exist. Do have navigation systems, do have backup plans. When you go to a national park or a provincial park that may have some walk-in sites or stuff, those are good. They're great, and they're great ways to test your gear and stuff. But you have a lot of advantages. If something goes wrong, you're rarely more than a yell away from help, or you can call someone and they will come help you out. Usually, if you're in backcountry, like true backcountry and backcountry crown land, if you can make a phone call, if you can get hold of someone, if you don't have the right gear to let them know where you're to, and it could take them days to find you. Anyone who thinks that it wouldn't be that hard has never looked for someone in the woods, because you don't have to get very twisted around and think you're on one lake and you're not. And they'll send people and they'll spend 2-3 days searching that one lake and the shoreline and getting people to walk the area, only to find out you're 2 lakes over. It can happen.
And it happens easy.
It does. So make sure you kind of know where you're going, what you're doing. Let people know that you're going there. Ideally, preferably, camp with some other people. Camp with people with somewhat of similar knowledge or better knowledge than you. Ideally, I would never camp with anyone who knows less than me. But that's that's ideal, not necessarily.
Ideally. But we end up doing it a lot. Not that we know a lot, it's just we introduce a lot of people to the woods.
And I thought of it, it says that sounds arrogant, but the fact is I take a lot of new people out sometimes, or people that have done similar stuff but not quite what I do, and so I get to share my knowledge and stuff. And I still almost always learn something from them too. So it's not like it's a complete unequal footing, but yeah, it's fun to explore and show this stuff to people. And I hope some of you guys get out there if you haven't, and if you do, I'd love to hear about it. It's great. But yeah, those are sort of the big things. It's freedom and less security versus more security, but a hell of a lot less freedom. Generally, is the way to look at it. Regardless, always look up your local rules and regulations. Always understand the limitations. Check the fire index for your area. What else? Make sure you have the right gear. Always plan. These are things that we've always said. Always plan for at least one extra day. That doesn't mean you need to book one extra day off work. Now, don't tell your work that you're doing this, but if you're going in, make sure that people know that if something goes wrong, you may be a day delayed getting back because you could get windbound on a lake, or you could twist your ankle and just not be able to get out as fast. And make sure that someone knows that. Don't plan on, but don't plan not to. You know what I mean? Like, make sure that you have a backup option. That includes things like make sure you have the food, because there's no point in getting back there, something going wrong, and all of a sudden not having enough food, not having the right shelter, not having things to deal with the possible outcomes. And this is true for the national parks and any other parks. You could get back there and get stuck. My father-in-law tells an awesome story. Him and his buddy went back Keji. The winds came up and they were shore bound for 24 hours. They tried. They could not get out. The next day, the wind actually turned 180 degrees the other way. They literally hooked the paddles up to their jackets like a sail, and it pushed them clean across the lake where they wanted to go. Where the day before, you couldn't paddle hard enough to get headway.
Yeah. I think that's... I'm not going to add any more. Let's go with that, because we are at our hour, and like most things, we could talk for ages on this stuff. But one last little safety thing, because Steve said it here, and I think it's worth mentioning. Anybody going out camping this weekend, just be doubly, especially here in Nova Scotia, just be doubly prepared. Temperatures are supposed to drop well. We're supposed to be in the minus 40s. So, yeah. And that's minus 40 Celsius, by the way, folks. Just dress warm, bring lots, have a backup plan if you are planning to go out this weekend.
You see? 5 degrees in Vancouver.
I think we're sitting at minus 20 right now. Somewhere between minus 15 minus 20.
Here, Thursday through Monday, 8 degrees.
Well, that's the thing. And okay, officially podcast over, folks, if you want to tap out by all means. But the ramble at the end, as we always do. I was just talking to Mel and a few other people. The reality is, a couple days ago, it was plus 10. A couple days forward, it's going to be minus 40. And a couple days after that, it's back up to plus 7. The temperature here is, like, the weather in general is so wild here in Nova Scotia this year. It is insane to try and figure out how to prepare for it going out into the woods. I've done a couple little day hikes and stuff like that and literally gone in, bundled up. It's been cold, windy, and walked out because it has shot up like 10, 15, 20 degrees in the difference over the course of maybe 10 hours. But yeah, anyway, my rant for the night. I think I'm good with that. Is there anything else you wanted to add in there, Ben?
No, I think we covered a lot of it. I mean, there's always more to learn. I think you said it best at the beginning. Look up your local rules and regulations. That's the highlights of it. There's no bad place to camp, but there are places that are illegal, and there are places where you just definitely cannot do it. So, yeah, get out there, enjoy it.
All right, folks. We'll see you We will see you next week. Get out there, have fun, play safe, get dirty, all that good stuff. Let us know about it, and we'll talk to you next week. Night, everyone.